Hello and welcome to the second public seminar of this academic year, organized by the Institute of Criminology. I'm Manuel Eisner. I'm the Wilson Professor of Criminology and the Director of the Institute. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here as convener of this seminar today. Our main speaker today is Isabella Zick. Isabella is Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Córdoba. She's also Visiting Professor at the Institute of Criminology and a Visiting Fellow at Wilson College, and at the University of Córdoba. She's a member of LECOVI, the Laboratorio de Estudios sobre Convivencia y Prevención de la Violencia, which means a center for research on pro-social behavior and prevention of violence. Her main research interest focuses on prevention of problem behaviors in young people, including bullying and cyberbullying, with particular attention to personal and contextual risk and protective factors. She is the director of 4 major research projects focused on problem behaviors online and offline. She is a consultant to Cambridge Assessment in relation to positive school climate, and she is the editor-in-chief of the journal Aggression and Violent Behavior. And if you've ever been editor of a journal, it's a heck of a lot of work. She's also the lead author of a systematic review, which was funded under the Campbell Collaboration Countering Violent Extremism Evidence Synthesis Program. And she will talk about this with us tonight. Following her talk, Peter Neighbor will be providing initial input. In particular, he will give an overview of the wider Countering Violent Extremism Evidence Synthesis Program, worth to say, launched by the Campbell Collaboration. He is an associate professor in evidence-based policing at the Institute of Criminology. Peter served 30 years as a police officer in Hampshire, West Mercia, and as chief constable in Thames Valley. And he set up and ran the National Policing Improvement Agency as a CEO. He's currently the director of the MSc Police Executive Program and editor-in-chief of the journal Policing, the Journal of Policy and Practice, and a fellow of Wilson College, Cambridge. We're trying to do something new today with respect to discussion. So we will be having a discussion after the presentations, in that we will be trying to bring together the remote audience, so you won't be seeing. We also have a remote audience of about 20 or 30 participants who are joining us online. And we would like to bring together discussion and questions from you here with the remote audience. Usually you're being told that you should switch off your mobile phones. This is the contrary. You're encouraged to switch on your mobile phones. If you have laptops here, you're encouraged to switch on your laptops. You go to Slido, you enter this code, and then you're encouraged to ask questions as the talk goes on. Slido has an anti-academic bias in that you're only allowed to ask questions that are not more than 160 characters. So if you have a complicated question, you can't ask these questions. We may be making exceptions in unusual circumstances, and you can ask the questions in person. You can't ask the questions in 160 characters, but we have a preference for asking short questions. You will be seeing the questions that others ask, and you can like the question. You can't dislike the questions, but you can like the questions, and that gives us an idea of which questions may be most relevant for those of you both here in person and present online. Isabella, it's great to have you here. The floor is yours.
I can just, sorry. The last slide, not the first one. Okay, so hello everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the Institute of Criminology for having me here, especially Professor Manuel Eisner and also Dr. Ariel for the invitation to be here today. And of course, thank you for coming. So this seminar focuses on radicalization. The main question is radicalization a family issue? And what I'm going to present are lessons learned from a comprehensive systematic review of risk and protective factors, consequences, and interventions against radicalization. So, what is radicalization? Well, there are many different definitions of radicalization, but probably the most used definition has to do with radicalization being a complex social psychological process through which people acquire a series of extreme beliefs, attitudes, and ideologies, justifying the use of violence to achieve their goals, and also promote these ideologies. So the main point about radicalization is basically using violence to defend the cause. And this is how we understood radicalization in this systematic review. So basically, all our included studies focus on this kind of radicalization. But the truth is that some people hold radical beliefs, while other people would perform actually violent actions to defend the cause. So we also know that radical beliefs are not necessary or sufficient for becoming a terrorist or a person who uses radical violence, but it is usually assumed that this is the first step. So basically, most models in the field would say people first hold radical beliefs, and then some of them would progress to use violence to defend the cause. So this is why we talk about cognitive and behavioral radicalization. So cognitive radicalization would be defined as support for or expression of willingness to commit violence to defend the cause. So some people would just say, yeah, I support beating people to defend the specific cause, for example. While radical behavior would be, or behavioral radicalization would be actually commission of violence to defend the cause. And there are different types of causes, of course, but at least in our systematic review and also in many other studies, the most common topics, fields in radicalization would focus on extreme right, extreme left, Islamist, and unspecified radicalization. So unspecified would be, for example, just asking people, do you think that using violence to defend a cause is fine, for example? Right? So it wouldn't be specifying exactly what cause, but just asking them if violence is something that could be used to defend. And now we must think, well, why do we want to focus on findings in radicalization? Because, of course, there are many different topics, many different studies in the field of radicalization, and there are many different possible risk and protective factors that need to be studied. But in our case, we wanted to focus on radicalization and family. So, although family-focused risk and protective factors predict many different antisocial behaviors, including delinquency, for example, there are still present gaps in knowledge that relate to family and radicalization. So basically, we know that families are important. They are important for many different problem behaviors. We know that from criminology and other fields. But the studies about families and radicalization, well, we know that there are many studies on that topic, but findings were sort of inconsistent, and we really needed something, a study that would provide a global vision of this field. And why would family factors relate to radicalization? Because, well, we know that they relate to other problem behaviors, but why would we think that they relate to radicalization? Well, we based our systematic review on several theories, so these are just some of them. But basically, we would think that they are important for radicalization because from social learning theories, we know that parents are treated as models of different behaviors, and we know that these behaviors are imitated by their children. And it also happens with other family members, or other people who are just close to one. So we know that people would observe and imitate behaviors, and we know that families are people who one would relate to quite frequently. So it's plausible to think that, well, probably children or other family members would learn from other radicalized families. And we also know that intergenerational transmission of antisocial behavior is a common phenomenon. We know this from other fields, other studies. It's also known that parenting is important. So we know that it's related to mental health, individual social well-being, which can actually become risk factors for radicalization. So it can be important in this indirect way as well. And there are other theories and other concepts that are important. So for example, social capital, we know that within the social structures formed by radicalized family members, we could think that maybe pro-social behaviors are dissuaded and antisocial behaviors and radicalization could potentially be promoted. So yes, so it seems that it's reasonable to think that family factors are important for radicalization, but does it even matter? Well, it does. It does. So because we know that family-related factors could be crucial to explain radicalization, and we know that most of the empirical studies in the field include a limited number of participants and variables, which is also true for almost any other field. So we know that empirical research cannot really involve enough participants to produce as strong evidence as systematic reviews will. And we know that families are also likely to be negatively impacted by radicalization, and given the importance of families in people's lives and societies in general, it's reasonable to think that family-focused prevention and intervention programs against radicalization could be especially effective. But for that, we need to know which factors and if those factors actually relate to radicalization. These are the research questions for our systematic review and meta-analysis. So we basically focused on three main questions. The first one was about family-related risk and protective factors for radicalization. So we wanted to discover which factors are important and which factors are related to radicalization. Then we also wanted to focus on consequences. So we wanted to know if radicalization impacts family and what is its impact, what are the consequences of radicalization for families. And also if family-based interventions against radicalization are effective. So basically what we wanted to do in the systematic review is just to get this global vision, a panorama of what we know about families and radicalization. And for that, we decided to conduct a systematic review with Campbell collaboration. Why? Well, because Campbell collaboration systematic reviews are high quality, are top quality. These reviews focus on important topics, and then they follow very, very strict and rigorous methodology. So there are 3 steps for a Campbell systematic review. The first one is title registration. So when authors decide on the topic, one needs to register a title with Campbell systematic reviews. They also review the title registration. They let you know if this topic is important, if your focus is fine. They also check if there are other systematic reviews and meta-analysis that could potentially overlap. And then there is a protocol stage. So the protocol stage is already a stage where a strict methodology is developed, which is really, really useful because it is reviewed, and it's also reviewed by the editors. And one gets a very, very detailed feedback on the plan. So if I plan to conduct a systematic review, I can get back on the quality of what I'm suggesting to do, what I'm proposing to do, and also some very, very good advice on how to improve my systematic review before it's done, which is really, really great. And then there is proper review, and it also gets reviewed, and one also gets help from reviewers and editors, which is fantastic. So why we wanted to conduct a systematic review and meta-analysis? In general, what is a systematic review and meta-analysis? What a systematic review is basically what you can see on this image. So it's putting together different empirical studies to gain a global vision of a field. So to understand what is known, what works best, and what needs to be done next. So a global panorama of a field cannot really be obtained through empirical research because the number of participants is limited, the number of variables is limited, and also systematic reviews use rigorous methods and objective results. So this is also very important because I'm sure that many of you have read many narrative reviews as well, which are also very useful. But a narrative review would not use the specific rigorous methods for analyzing included studies. So basically, this means that systematic reviews are mostly objective. So they do not really depend on the person who, the author doesn't choose the studies according to their own criteria, but they are chosen according to some very specific and rigorous criteria and search methods and so on. So this basically means that it's a study that can be actually done again with apparently by other people and would probably get the same results. So there are specific aims, research strategies, inclusion-exclusion criteria, then studies are coded, and if a meta-analysis is performed, overall effect sizes are calculated to statistically describe different phenomena. So these kinds of studies are actually, I would say, the best possible methodology to gain a global vision of the field. But of course, there are some risks, and it's very important to get this global vision of the field, but we do not want to mix apples and oranges, which basically means that we really need all the included studies to focus on the same topic, on the same phenomenon. Because if we, for example, if we focus on radicalization, as I said, in this case, radicalization was defined as using violence to defend the cause. But of course, there are other possible types of definitions. So, for example, just to give you one example, we found some studies that define radicalization as rebel mindset in the 60s and the 70s. And it was measured as, for example, not wearing a bra. Yeah, because apparently females in the 60s and 70s were expected to be rebels. But of course, this is not what we wanted to include here, right? So just to give you one example, why we need to be so specific regarding strategies and methodologies, because what we want is to focus on a specific phenomenon, and then we want to compare studies that are really focused on the same thing, on the same topic. So this is why we conducted this very comprehensive systematic review. And of course, to get global vision of the field, it's necessary to run very comprehensive searches. So we searched 25 databases and hence searched gray literature. And this was done from April to July 2021. So this was done using specific keywords focused on, well, just to give you an idea, basically this is done by introducing specific keywords in specific search fields. So in this case, we had specific keywords focused on radicalization. So it was radicalization, extremism, terrorism, any other possible term that would focus on radicalization. And then this was combined with family. So this was family, daughters, siblings, parents, mother, father, and so on. And then this was combined with terms related to risk and protective factors, consequences, and interventions. So again, risk factors, protective factors, consequences, interventions, evaluation, programs, and so on. And then these searches, as everything else in our systematic review, were performed by 2 independent researchers. So this systematic review is actually authored by me as the first author, and a person who was my PhD student, and now she's a doctor, so by Dr. Elena Nasais. And we did everything together but separate. So this means that it was all double checked, just in case. We didn't want to miss anything. And I hope we have. Right, so we searched 25 databases, then leading researchers in the field. We asked them to provide some published and unpublished studies, and they were very nice. Many people provided studies. That was very good. We also went through reference lists of the included studies. Also, we searched citing studies on Google Scholar. It was really huge. And then we also established this inclusion and exclusion criteria, because of course in a systematic review first we search, but then we need to know what we are going to include. So in this case, we decided to include everything that is on the specific topic, but as I said, we don't want to mix apples and oranges. So how we did that? Well, we included published and unpublished studies, which is important because as you know, there is this publication bias, right? So when people get significant results, they get published. And then in results that are not significant, it's much easier not to get, it's much more difficult to get published. And some researchers wouldn't even submit those papers at all because they don't get an effect, nothing. But these are absolutely crucial because if we don't include them, we might miss an important part of research in the field. So we included published and unpublished papers, and we only included quantitative studies. To be honest, we wanted to include quantitative and qualitative studies, but Campbell people were very wise and they said, we don't think it's a good idea to put them all in the same systematic review because it's going to be too much. And they were completely right, because when we started, when we actually ran the searches, it was just overwhelming. You will see in the next slide. So that was a great idea. I mean, I love many of the qualitative studies in the field because I read several of those papers and they were very good. But this is, I guess, next systematic review. I think if anyone is interested, we can think of it at some point. But in this case, we included quantitative studies. Then we focus on family-related risk and protective factors, the impact of radicalization on family and family-focused intervention. Then we included studies published with any year, location, any demographic characteristics, also any language. We didn't limit this to any language. And it was quite challenging, to be honest, because, well, we are familiar with many languages, fortunately, but we located some papers in, I think, in Korean and in Arabic. And we actually contacted some colleagues and friends who we knew and asked them, please help me with this one. Fortunately, for us, these studies were excluded, so we didn't really have to go into details in languages that we don't know. But yeah, but we know English, Spanish language. So anyway, then we focused on studies that measured the relation between family-related factor and radicalization, or included family-focused intervention against radicalization. So that was important. So basically, the study that measured this relation, because there were some studies that would focus on families, focus on radicalization, but would not measure the proper relation between those variables. And also family-focused intervention. Then family-related risk and protective factors. For those studies, radicalized individuals have to be compared to general population. This was important just because we didn't want to, again, put together studies that would focus on different phenomena. So for example, there were some studies that would focus on differences between terrorists and murderers. So these were not included because it was a different thing, right? Or some studies that would focus on radicals who were like more radicalized and then other radicals who were less radicalized, but they were all radicalized. So these were also a different topics and were excluded. And then, as I said, the definition of radicalization that was really important, so was support or commission of violence to defend a cause, including also support for radical groups. So radical groups were, for example, just neo-Nazi people. So if someone said, yeah, I support neo-Nazi groups, it was included, or some people would like agree on some neo-Nazi slogans, things like that. So about the data collection, as I said, we conducted very broad searches and we found, more than 86,000 studies. So that was really a lot. That was really a lot. It's not that common to find this high number of studies in a systematic review. But I think the main reason for that was that it seems that there is this term, family of radicals, that is not necessarily from social sciences. So it has to do with chemistry also and maths. So we found a lot of studies that were not relevant, but they were there and they would, they had to be excluded basically. So we screened all those studies together, but separately, again, as I said. So Elena screened 86,000 studies and I screened also 86,000 studies. So we screened titles and abstracts and we excluded the irrelevant records. We kept those that seemed relevant. Were not necessarily relevant, but they seemed relevant from title and abstract. And then we screened full texts. And again, at this stage, this was done separately, but at this stage, we really kept those that were relevant, and those that seemed relevant but were not were again excluded. So then we finally included 33 studies, of which 30 were used in the meta-analysis, because 3 of those studies, they didn't provide enough data for calculating of common effect size or overall effect size. So we basically coded and analyzed those 33 studies. And as I said, this was done by the 2 of us, and our agreement rates were high. So we calculated agreement rates at every single stage. So the lowest agreement rate was of 93%. This was the lowest. But then, for example, at the title and abstract screening, I think it was almost 100%. It was very, very, very high. And disagreements were, of course, solved by discussion and just, agreement. But they were mostly easy to solve because most of those disagreements were basically just overlooking, just missing some detail or just a typo. Like when one extracts information, for example, the number of participants, so maybe it was not exactly the same. In some very specific cases, we just went back to the original papers, checked, and put the right numbers. So this is really good. It takes a lot of time and effort, but I think this is really good because I think we're pretty confident and that what we have in the systematic review is actually correct. Because, as I said, we checked it. I mean, I think we checked it. Each one of us checked it 2 times. Not only double checked it, but maybe triple checked it, even more. So what about these 33 studies? Well, all of them focused on family-related risk and protective factors, right? So we didn't find any studies focused on consequences, at least not conceptualized as such. I think this is also important because as many of them were cross-sectional, it's sometimes difficult to tell risk protective factors from consequences, but most of them, I mean, all of them were conceptualized as family-related risk and protective factors. None of them was conceptualized as consequences. And we didn't find any interventions that would have been evaluated with quantitative methodology, right? We did find many interventions, maybe not many, but several interventions. But all of them were evaluated with qualitative methodology. So none of them met our inclusion criteria. So then we coded those studies, right? And coding actually is also very, very, very strict when one is conducting a humble systematic review, which means that there is a coding scheme that needs to be developed at the protocol stage, right? And then humble people would take a look at it and give you advice on it. So actually our first coding scheme was not detailed enough. I still remember that. And they said, oh, no, we don't like this. Well, it's not like we don't, but you need more. That was very useful. It was very good because it's really good to know what you are going to do beforehand. Because you see, if you already code all those studies and then you finish the systematic review and then it's not good enough, that's a big problem. So it's really, really helpful and really, really useful to have this guidance and advice. So yes, so we developed a very detailed coding scheme, and here's just like the very short version of what we coded. But you can check it in our protocol, it's published. So our coding included details on study citations, study titles, article, thesis, and so on, the country where the study was conducted. Then details about participants, so basically number of participants, and male, female, ethnic, cultural background, socioeconomic status, and so on. Then procedures, so how the study was conducted, if it's good enough, if it was conducted in prisons, schools, stratification, and so on. Then family factors that were measured and how they were measured. So what kind of factors were included, like parenting styles, maybe having children, different possibilities and how they were measured. Then terms used for radicalization. So as I said, some would use radicalization, but some of them would use violent extremists. So that was also a proxy. Some of them would use terrorism as well, and some of them would use people who are convicted and so on. So basically the terms and the measurement, so how this was measured. So some of them were, for example, based on self-reports, while other studies could have been based on official records. Then the results, so we extracted all those statistics from the studies. So these were basically focused on the relation between family factors and radicalization, but there was more because some of them were cognitive, behavioral, some of them were for different types of radicalizations, different groups, so it was a lot of information. And then we also coded quality, and this was based on the Cambridge quality checklist. So we checked the quality of those studies. This is also compulsory in Cambridge, so that's why it's also a good thing, because readers can know if your evidence is based on high quality studies, or if those studies are still not as good as they could be. So then we extracted 83 primary effect sizes. As I said, because they were focused on different types of radicalization, different groups, different possible variables. And then these effect sizes were focusing on 48 different variables that we grouped into 14 factors. We grouped them into 14 factors that were as meaningful as possible. But we also included a separate analysis of those 48 variables. So readers can really know what was done. And if a reader, for example, doesn't like our grouping into 14 factors, that's still fine, because one can read what is known about 48 variables separately. So about our 14 factors. You can see them on the screen. So basically, we focused on critical family events. Some studies would use this term, so they would actually measure what they call critical family events. But some of them would, for example, divorce, family death, and so on. We grouped them all into critical family events. But as I said, we also conducted separate analysis. So, for example, we have analysis for divorce only, or for death only. But we have also the whole factor called critical family event. Then we had extremist family members. This was quite straightforward. Then we have family commitment. So we also included proxy terms like importance of family, involvement in family. Then we have family conflict. So we included conflict with parents, but also other types of conflict within family. Then we have family size. So family size, some studies would measure size as such, but some studies would measure having children. We also included that. But as I said, we have separate analysis also if someone is interested in just checking if having children has an effect. Then family socioeconomic status, so we had education, poverty, family income. Of course, some of them had to be reversed scored, but this was done in our case. So we had like high education that would be combined with low poverty or higher income. Then family violence, it would be violence among parents, among children, different types of violent relations within families. And then we had having immigrant spouse, that was also straightforward, it wouldn't fit in any other category, so we left it as it was. Then we had marital status. In marital status, we had being married, but also not being single, because there were some studies that focused on being single or not. It's not exactly the same as being married, but we thought it was meaningful to put them together. Then parental control, so with control over children's behavior not being permissive. Then there was this concept of parental elbow mentality. It wouldn't fit in other categories, so we left it as it was. So it was about like being the best, even if you have to sort of harm other people. Then parental politics communication. So this had to do with talking about politics with parents. Religious household, that was quite straightforward. And then there was another concept that was parental ethics socialization. So it was related to bias and mistrust promoted by parents towards other ethnic groups. All right, so then when we grouped those factors, we ran separate meta-analysis for each of those factors and moderator analysis for each of those meta-analysis when possible. So that was also a lot of work because we had to calculate a lot of different effect sizes. And this is just an overview of our findings. So what we found in the whole meta-analysis, where we studied the relation between each family factor and radicalization as a whole, is that there are some risk factors that are marked in red and some protective factors that are in green. So we found that undesirable ethnic socialization, this was based on one study only, but it's an important, interesting finding, was a risk factor for radicalization. Also having extremist family members, based on 2 studies, we have a number of studies also on the screen, so it's always explicitly stated. And family conflict. These were risk factors for radicalization. Then regarding protective factors, we found high family socioeconomic status. We found higher, larger family size and more family commitment. Then we also calculated separate effect sizes for different types of radicalization. So we focused, for example, on cognitive radicalization. And what we found was that risk factors for cognitive radicalization were, again, undesirable ethnic socialization, family violence, and family conflict. And then protective factors were family size, bigger family size, family commitment, and parental control. Regarding behavioral radicalization, so this actually means like performing violent action to defend a cause. We found risk factors such as having extremist family members and critical family events. And then protective factors such as family socioeconomic status and family commitment. But again, as you can see, this was not based on a very high number of studies because the number of studies on radical behaviors in general was not as high as we would like it to be. So this is something that should be done in future. This is one of future recommendations. Regarding Islamist radicalization, because we also analyzed different types, like different causes that were defended through violence. So we found risk factors such as family violence and conflict, and protective factors such as family, socioeconomic status, high status. Then for left-wing radicalization, we found risk factors such as family conflict, violence, and critical family events, and protective factors such as high family socioeconomic status, family commitment, and parental control. For right-wing radicalization, risk factors such as extremist family members, family conflict, and violence, and protective factors such as family socioeconomic status, family commitment, and parental control. These are our findings. And regarding the quality of the included studies, of course, because this is also very important. So we know that we have those effect sizes. We know that we located those risk and protective factors, but now we need to know what the quality of the included studies is. So basically, we know that none of the located studies focused on family-related consequences for intervention. So they didn't meet any in our inclusion and exclusion criteria, and these studies are still to be conducted. Then regarding the studies focused on risk and protective factors, the number of included studies was quite high, which is really good. But we must take into account that factors were quite heterogeneous, and they were divided into 14 categories, which means that the number of studies per category was not particularly high. But the good news is that we didn't find evidence of much publication bias. And when because Campbell reviews, I should add this, also check possible publication bias. So we didn't find much evidence for that in most of our meta-analysis. And even if there was some evidence, it wouldn't change much the results, because the results are corrected for this possible bias, and there was not much change. So there was not much publication bias. Then regarding the Cambridge quality checklist that we used, none of the included studies showed causal relations. So we cannot really say, based on our study, that we don't know if family factors really cause radicalization. This is something that has to be studied in future. We cannot say that it doesn't. That's also important. It might, but it's something that we have to check. Then several studies were scored as relatively high in quality criteria for correlate or risk and protective factors, which is good. But many analyses were based on studies which quality could be improved. So this is also something for future. In most of the studies, samples were relatively high, which is good. Were large, which is good. And many had random selection of participants. But high quality validated instruments were not used very frequently. So this is something that should also be improved in future. And I should point out that the best quality study that we have is actually by Yvette et al. And this is from the Proto, right? So the Proto that is led by Professor Manuel Eisner, which we were very pleased to find. So about implications of our systematic review, there are several implications for policy in practice. So although we know that we were not able to find or to check if there are any causal relations between family-related factors and radicalization, it is reasonable to suggest that policies and practice should aim at decreasing family-related risks and increasing protective factors. So based on our findings, we believe that these are the most important recommendations, right? So it's important to decrease bias against minorities, because it was based on one study only, but it was an important finding. So we found that parental ethnic socialization was found to be related to more radicalization. So this was ethnic socialization that would sort of promote bias. So decreasing bias against other cultures and ethnicity, teaching about different cultures and teaching that people are all equal, would probably be desirable to decrease radicalization. It's also important to counter radicalization and extremism in families, because based on 2 studies, we found that having extremist family members was related to more radicalization. So it would be good to focus on families, not only on individuals. Then it's important to decrease family conflict and find good ways to promote peaceful solution of those problems in families. So maybe acquiring skills for desirable conflict resolution would be good. Then increase education, decrease poverty. We found that high socioeconomic status, which was measured as a combination of education, income, was protected against radicalizations. And it was based on 6 studies. So it would be desirable to increase education and decrease poverty and social inequalities. Then we should understand between family size and radicalization. We know that bigger family size was related to less radicalization based on 3 studies. This could be, this is a possibility, this could be driven by having children, because many of those studies were focused on having children, and this could be a sign of good social functioning for some people, probably not for everybody, but maybe for some. And it would be interesting to understand this relation. Then promote family commitment. This was based on 10 studies, including the process study, actually. So family commitment, involvement, proxy constructs were found to be protected. So promoting parental involvement, provision, care, and importance could potentially decrease radicalization. Then it's important to design and evaluate family-based interventions. As I said, we did find some interventions that were qualitatively evaluated, but quantitative evaluation is still needs to be conducted. So they could be a promising way to decrease radicalization, but empirical evidence is urgently needed. So if any of you is still thinking about the possible topics for your MPhil thesis or PhD, maybe this is a good thing to think of, right? Maybe you can do this, and maybe you could be pioneers in the world for those kinds of interventions. Then conduct more high-quality studies on risk and protective factors as well. So longitudinal prospective studies with representative samples would be important. Also, of course, RCTs, so randomized trials would be good. That could control for confounding variables before the risk and protective factors are measured. This is something that needs to be done according to the Cambridge Quality Checklist to tell if to sort of check causality, or just to as a proxy of causality. So there are many variables that need to be controlled for before measuring actually the risk and protective factors. Then describe the impact of radicalization on families. Again, consequences need to be studied. We know that from different theories and literature reviews that they could be important, but this is something that still needs more research. So basically, these are the most important recommendations. Again, decrease bias against minorities, counter extremism in families, decrease family conflict, increase education, decrease poverty, understand the relation between family size and radicalization, promote family commitment, design and evaluate family-based interventions, conduct more high-quality studies on risk and protective factors, and describe the impact of radicalization on families. So, yeah, this is published. So the results, if you want more information, of course, you can ask as many questions as you wish. Then you can also email me if you have more questions. Then, of course, we can talk about different topics afterwards, after the lecture. And this is also published as a Campbell systematic review with my co-author, Elena Masescu. And of course, a special thank you to Campbell Collaboration for making this possible, to Professor Peter Neyret, who actually made this series of systematic reviews possible, as you will see in a while. Also to the Department of Homeland Security, and to all authors who provided also studies and helped us with this systematic review. And thank you for listening. and thank you for your attention. Yeah. Thank you.
I should be brief, but I wanted to put this into context. So, relevant page. So this is one of a very important series of reviews, and this started out as a journey. I think 6 years ago, when myself and the head of research from the Department of Homeland Security sat at the American Society of Criminology. Can't remember whether alcohol was involved, but it's probably ought to have been. But the critical thing was Rick Legault, who holds that post, saying to me, you know, we've got so many studies going on, we've got so many different policies flying around, that we really need to put this together. And, you know, could you, Campbell, help us? Well, it's been a long journey for Campbell. David Farrington, you were there right at the beginning on the day it was founded, and played a huge part in getting this off the ground. But we were still a relatively small organisation in these terms, and we hadn't done the number of reviews that we wanted to at this stage. So when Rick said we want a program and it's going to run for 4 or 5 years and we want to get 30 reviews, there was a sort of gasp from me, let alone. And anyway, so we started out on this journey, and you'll see the sponsors. This was the 5RD, which is the 5 ICE countries. Actually, the review that Isabella has done was specifically sponsored by Australia, because they identified that the family issues were one of their major concerns. So that was an Australian one, but we've also got, apart from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, USA and the UK, we've also got Sweden as well. So it's a group of 6 with another 18 countries engaged in the process. And this is what we were trying to do. We have a website. So if you go to campbellcollaboration.org and put in terrorism into the search bar, you'll come up with the website with these words on it. So we're looking for evidence on effective interventions. We're looking for evidence on tools and strategies that might be effective when intervening with individuals to try and reduce violence. We are looking for approaches to measure performance, because this is also driven by government policy trying to find ways to do this better. And you know, it would be difficult to claim that the prevent approach in the UK has run without hazard, because it has not. And actually, one critical part of that is having good measurements and good tools to understand and track whether things are actually happening you're expecting to happen. Because let's be clear, a lot of, if we start to talk about the state intervening or supporting different types of interventions with family, this is critical stuff for which you need good evidence to try and avoid doing harm, and to try and make sure that what you're doing is good, and also that the messaging out there is accurately saying why we're doing this, what the evidence is, and why this is a purposive way to try and create a reduced level of terrorism and violence in our societies. Those are the sponsors thus far, and we started out with a batch of 4, to which Canada then added another batch of 4, and then we had another lot of 4 from the Department for Homeland Security. Added to that an evidence and gap map, and added to that another 4 that we're in the process of doing. We're up at 18, 19 reviews at the moment, and David will know that's on a scale that Campbell kind of never dreamt of until this point. So it's been important. I am not going to read through all the reviews that have been done. You are going to go on the website and find them. They are not. I make no claims about the fact that they're light reading. These are very, very serious pieces. But just to pick out some highlights, there's been a lot of focus on whether radicalisation narratives work. If you want to know the answer to that, read Sarah Carthy and colleagues' review, in which it started off when the evidence that was easily available started to suggest, so the stuff that was mostly in the public domain started to suggest that they didn't work. When we managed to prize the grey literature out of the government's concerns and stuff that they'd been doing, it demonstrated that actually it probably did work if it was done in a targeted fashion. Coming down the piece, I think probably the other one I would pair with Isabella's, which I think is a really critical read, is when we hear the coverage of a major terrorist incident, I guarantee you that somewhere in the early part of the narrative, someone will mention the word mental health. And if you read the Salma, Carthy and Cox review that was published earlier this year, you will discover that that is a pretty inappropriate place to start. The evidence does not support that at all. What it does support is focusing more on family factors and a range of other factors. And the other one which I would commend you to read is another giant review, which is the Wolfowitz, Manovitz, Weisberg and Hassisi one on risk and protective factors, which again points you in directions that you might not have found if you've been reading the Daily Mail. I'm not sure whether that's these are the in-flight ones, and we've got, so the in-flight ones, we've got protocols. We're trying to land, we're trying to finish and land this particular batch. And you'll see as you go down these again, these are some incredibly important reviews on, for example, bottom one, which is one nearer to bottom one, which is Kurt Braddock's one on government-led communication. But does it work? Is it worthwhile government investing in this, which it does incredibly importantly? This is large sums of money that are spread out there. Does it work? Hold that thought. We don't know yet because Kurt is still working on that one. And we have 4 reviews that I'm trying to find hosts for at the moment. So I'm the co-chair of the Campbell Collaboration. I'm the principal investigator for this program. And it has been a long journey. I am in the process of negotiating, which I very much hope we'll be able to do here. The first one, which is recidivism and violent extremism actors. I think many of you in the room will understand why that is incredibly important to this institute to look at that particular issue. And I've got a team to do number 4, and I'm hoping that I can have a teams to do numbers 2 and 3, looking at Isabella. And if you're interested in another journey, I think human trafficking and radicalisation is a pretty important one, but also the use of language, because critically that has become a big issue, particularly for the European parts of the process. And that is a good place to stop and just encourage you to go onto the site, to read the reviews. There are plain language summaries if you just want to get the kind of highlights of it, and to understand that what we are trying to do is to make sure that every government that is going down this route of prevent has got readily access to these materials in order to improve the global policy on preventing terrorism and radicalisation in a way that involves doing harm whilst doing good. That's the mission of the Campbell Collaboration. Thank you.
So thank you very much, both of you. First of all, to Isabella for the comment. I'll just say 2 or 3 words, just for you to find the time. I have to show you the slide number again. Okay, I will. Can you just go back to my holding slide on the second page? So here is the number if you want to ask questions. Could have told you to. Questions, but I want to use that to say that I'm extremely pleased to have David Farrington here. I mean, he's one of the giants who's, contributed enormously to the Institute, but also he's one of the leaders who've actually developed the Campbell Collaboration Crime and Justice Group and made this all possible. And it's become this hugely influential program of research globally. And it's just fantastic to have you here. So having said this, please do keep asking your questions while we start. We already have a few questions. You can also start liking the questions, but I would like to kick off with question to Isabella. Probably we'll see how this pans out, and it was others can kick in. But one of the questions that was asked is, Isabella, you started with sketching out the effects of possibilities of different theories of family factors and how they influence radicalization. And the question is whether there are different mechanisms at different ages developmentally. So the question I think of this that was asked is, but for instance, it would be important to understand better whether childhood risk factors in the first few years are different from, for instance, risk factors associated with adolescence, where the political process. I wanted to talk about this, and then the question is, we see anything in
Thank you very much for this question. I think this is really important. And yes, we wanted to look at it, to be honest. And not only on different age groups, but also, of course, on different family members. Because I don't think it could be the same to be influenced by parents, for example, the child, compared to being influenced by hope as an adult. So yes, this is an important topic, but fortunately, with the number of studies that we analyzed was not high enough, because as you have seen, we needed to. I mean, we located studies on many different family factors. Right? So we actually had 48 variables. Then we focus on family factors. Then we grouped them into 14 meaningful categories. And then we ended up with the number of studies that was not high enough to be able to compare age groups. But I think it's something that should be done in the future.
I focused on the screen. What I just noticed is that those who are joining remotely can't see the panel unless I go out. So that's why I'm moving here. So we have a number of new questions coming in, and I don't know yet how to manage them. There are more and more questions coming in. Very good. So I'm just going to the next one for now, which is the question. The question is: are these risk factors that you've been looking at and that you've identified, in your view, do you think they are risk factors for radicalization, or are they just risk factors for antisocial behavior? What is the difference? I mean, do you think they are specific to radicalization, or do you think you have evidence that they're specific, or are they just markers of general antisocial? But David would probably have called antisocial potential.
Maybe. Well, again, it's not a very easy question. Well, they could. I mean, I'm sure some of them are shared for other antisocial behaviors. While I would also say that some of them were specific. So, for example, having a radicalized family member is probably something that seems specific. But again, this would require new research done to confirm possible third risk and protective factors for different problem behaviors. But I think what matters here is also that even if they are shared with other antisocial behaviors, if they are a good starting point to prevent radicalization, I still think they are important for this specific field.
I've just seen that there is one question. Sorry,
I was just going to add something, which is that this is a classic of what, I mean, we're now at a position where we've got 12 all but landed. And one of the things that becomes very clear is that we're now in the process of moving a lot more effort communicating the messages that come collectively across them. So to answer that question, I think you need to read the Wolfowitz review on the risk factors and protective factors that apply to the difference between radicalization and action, to work out where these ones fit. And similarly, you need to look at some of the negative, the reverse judgments that are in the mental health review to work out where that might be. Okay, so we are due to put together a major strand of the Stockholm Symposium on this program. symposium, and in order to do just that, I had a promise from the unfortunately outgoing Swedish Prime Minister that she would chair it on the basis of trying to do just this, which is to bring them together and articulate for policymakers exactly what that question was implying, which is, sorry, where do we start? There's so much information. Because clearly you need to start with the bigger things and target and put effort into those. So I think the answer is you need to read the reviews together, and at some point we'll have the review of reviews. Already beginning to fill me with a sense of panic. but it needs a great idea, and we need it. I am not volunteering to write it just yet.
There's fantastic more questions. But I think this entire debate, I think what you're saying that we need to look at the whole picture of different studies and the different domains of risk factors and how they interact. And I just wanted to kind of like link to this with another question that has received quite a lot of likes now. Unfortunately, as you can see, the questions are jumping around all the time. So this is making it really hard for me to figure out. But the question that is currently on top is the question that I really find interesting, and maybe it's beyond family factors, namely cultural differences. The question is, how are cultural differences taken into account when analyzing the relationship between radicalization, between family factors and radicalization, and in some cultures, radicalization and high among the rich. And so, I mean, you were saying yourself that you find a lot of heterogeneity in the studies. But I wonder whether you have some thoughts, and I think, by the way, this question links to another question about socioeconomic contextual factors, so whether having, for instance, or growing up in a country with civil war, growing up in a country with massive disadvantage, discrimination of some group. How do you deal with this in the context of family factors?
Well, we need more studies. That's definitely the case. I mean, it would be great to be able to actually analyze all those possible. As I said, the number of studies is not really high enough to do this. But we do have in the systematic review, so we do have some cultural factors, so we do have some moderators that relate to Western countries and Muslim countries. We divided them as such because this is what was found in the literature. So these are the groups. But yeah, it would be. And
Can I just ask you? Because probably others will be interested in this as well. What is the geographic focus of the study? These 30 studies that we've included.
oh, we have many different countries.
Oh, you have many.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I mean, some of them would be from Western countries. They would call themselves countries, so that's why I call them.
Just one sort of clue to that. So I can't say that I played a massive part, but I supported Katia Carvalho from the University of Porto on her research, which took one sort of starting point, which was that Portugal has got quite a significant Muslim community and a Muslim heritage as well, going back a long time. There were no residents in Portugal, foreign fighters involved in Syria. There were Portuguese foreign fighters who were resident in London. And the question is, was that counteracting the protective factor of being in Portugal, and therefore the effect of Portuguese assimilation and culture on that potential? Which the answer is maybe. So, I mean, Paul Katcher came to try and to interview Portuguese families whose members were radicalised right in the middle of COVID in Leytonstone, which I think regard as a very, very high bar in terms of research. But a piece is compelling. It's about to be published. Again, it highlights the potential looking further at these issues.
I mean, we
do want to update.
Yeah,
we will update.
There was one question that links to this question of geographic coverage, which is an actual question. I thought was quite interesting. Maybe whether you found any studies in Latin America.
I don't think any of the studies. I don't think they actually. I mean, there are some studies, but they were not included because of inclusion. I would have to check it because I mean, really, the countries are very heterogeneous. I would have to check it, but I don't.
So this is not very well organized. There was another, again, interesting factual question I thought. And it goes back to family dynamics, namely the question on where the criminal history of the parents plays a role. And so this, I think, this plays on the question of causal mechanisms, which you think we're talking to us about. If there is an underlying mechanism that links radicalization, I think we're always torn, aren't we? Thinking of radicalization as a specific manifestation of criminality and thinking of radicalization as a political process. And probably it's a mix of both. And I think this question about the criminal history of parents is different from radical beliefs of themselves. And I wonder whether you found anything, or the question is whether you found anything on that.
Well, I don't think we had any studies with criminal record or criminal behavior as such, but we did find studies on radicalization in family members, for example, which relate to the topic, and also family conflict and violence. We did find some evidence related to problem. I mean, criminal behavior in families, but not criminal behavior as such. I don't think we actually look at that.
I want to ask questions. I would like to conclude with two questions on the politics of it, and two questions on the prevention side. There was one question here about what do you do in the end with it, and what are the global implications of the program? But I think I would also be quite interested to hear from Peter, given this massive program, what the experiences are with policy uptake of these research programs. How do policymakers actually, do they listen? What do they do with it? Or what would you expect them to do with it? I think that would be quite interesting to have kind of block of thought.
Okay, so clearly some of the earlier reviews landed in the midst of an administration in the USA that wasn't, I may say, wholly interested in it. But actually, as far as the policymakers are involved in the operational practice, certainly from the state side of things, the reviews have had quite significant, not least, which is the most recent one on mental health. Actually, why we put this territory. The government kind of looks at different approaches to government communication and radicalisation strategies. Again, important in focusing the efforts, and they've done well. What we've tried to produce, which we've tried to produce what the EHS called trifolds, where we talk about, so what do we do? What do we found? What does this mean? And get those into the hands of everybody who's got a significant role across the board. And we're encouraged to do that for every review. And then to run across the course of this next year, a combination of events targeted at the practitioners, events targeted at the academics and informed practitioners, and events targeted at the senior politicians. We're beginning to develop that program. Now that we've got a substantial amount to say, and we've got the capability to start to see the threads running across, we're going to keep going. But I had the conversation last night with DHS about where we got to so far. I think the fact that they are telling us that they want to put more money into furthering the program tells me that it is having, because on the whole, governments don't do more money unless they think it's having impact. It's having impact. I'd just like to see that impact in the review in this country and the practice and others. But we have a very receptive audience in Sweden, a very receptive audience in Australia. We've certainly had an impact in Canada, and the DHS assure us we've had an impact there. So I'm hoping that gradually, and by the way, the really big reveal next year is the evidence of the gag map that Lorraine Mazerol and colleagues in Australia are doing, where we'll start to see the kind of global picture of what we know, we need to know going forward, which will set the agenda for the next batch review. But as I would say, we still need more primary research. You can't systematic review avoid. I've been surprised, pleasantly surprised. At the start, I was told we'd have a lot of empty reviews. We've only had one review so far where it was virtually empty, which sadly was on community policing. But we want more reviews, more evidence upon which to base it, and then we can bring them together as a systematic approach by governments and practitioners.
John, I mean, I can also ask a more provocative. I just want to continue this question of what do these findings show, and I want to relate this briefly to the process study. And to the best of our knowledge, we have not a single person who is actually, who you could honestly describe as radicalized. So they may have different views on how much they think it's justified to back if you're being treated unfairly. But then, if you really ask yourself honestly, is there anybody in this room who thinks it's never justified to use violence if you're being treated deeply unfairly? There would probably maybe not be that many people. So whether you, I mean, that was one of my conclusions from the Zen process study. You measure something at a very low level of radicalization, if you will. Even so, it remains a tiny little group that we could honestly describe as radicalized. And then the problem becomes that you're trying to, it's interesting scientifically, but in terms of policy implications, you're saying, well, you end up having what the current estimate is of people who are genuinely radicalized in the UK. It's a very small number, and identifying these numbers on the basis of these prospective family risk factors has a number of difficulties. It's not just the difficulty of actually targeting the right people, but then there is the additional problem of stigmatization, because you end up saying, well, okay, you have a family conflict and you have smaller family size or large family size or whatever it is, and therefore you're at risk of radicalization. And that, and whether it's right ethically is yet another question. And so this is why I'm just interested in how you think about it.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree. I actually always cite you when we think of like the small number of percentage of people who cause 5% of problems, right? So I'm not sure what
it's Pareto. It's a Pareto principle. So basically, 20% of people cause 80% of problems.
Exactly. So even though the percentage of highly radicalized people is not that high, they are highly problematic. We need to do something about it, right? Then about well, basically the theory says that radical thinking could potentially progress in some people to radical behavior. So of course, people would have those radical thoughts, and they are not problematic per se for everybody. But they are a good start point, I think, for prevention. Maybe not exactly for intervention, but for those people are not convicted. They are just regular, normal people. But I think about those topics as other topics like health, for example. We want people not too small. We want people to eat healthy food. We want people to practice some kind of sports because it's just good for you. So I think many of those psychological and criminological factors could be conceptualized this way. So maybe they could be promoted in schools, for example. Or maybe, well, maybe there can be some programs for families who are going to expect parents. I know that there is a lot of preparation for delivery, right? So when a woman is pregnant, the person is pregnant, there is a lot of preparation for delivery, right? But not much preparation for what you should actually do with this child when you are a parent. So maybe those programs would be useful, and if they are implemented at the population level, then nobody would be stigmatized. But we would promote healthier societies, and this would be psychological health and well-being sense.
And my dreams are slightly less aspirational. For a very simple reason that when I have advised, when I was advised a series of and I'm very conscious that the government's position is that it can't sit back. It has to, if there's a threat of terrorism, potentially significantly disabling, it certainly is a major cause of very signal events in the party. The government's not going to step back and do something. My ambition is to make sure that when government does step forward, it's better informed about the choices, it's better informed about the potential backfire. And I very much, practical steps, as a Barrington review, was that finding myself in an office with a then Home Secretary Jackie Smith, who was wanting to do something crazy with CCTV. She'd been advised to do something. She wanted to do something crazy with CCTV, and slapping the Barrington review table and saying, but actually there is some evidence to support this. And furthermore, what you're proposing to do is clearly not the best evidence. And if we can get into a position where, at the very least, we're saying to government, don't do this, you'd be better off investing here. You'd be better off focusing. And actually, as far as terrorism is concerned, I don't think it is a Pareto principle. It's much smaller than that. I mean, the work that Larry and I did on looking at the most harmful offenders, we're talking about the 2% of offenders, not the 2% of the population, being the most harmful. And if that's the case, there is a reasonable prospect of us being able to prevent some of those serious things, and also to think about how we might prevent some of those significant fear in our, and also the stigmatization of communities that are not harmful. My ambitions are sort of more, I want to encourage government to do things that work, use the evidence. This is where we do that agenda that well put up is a practical agenda that I think will be very popular with ministers. It looks doable. It looks doable.
I think this is a beautiful, optimistic summary of where we may be going from both of you, and what the implications of this may be. And I would like to think that we give a round of applause to the two speakers. We will start outside, but we'll soon be light. Bring continue the conversation if you like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There is no system of possible and most special who actually taught me how to conduct it.